So now that you have your site collections and you're working with your owners to roll these out into the correct locations and with correct owners and have your users start populating it with their information, there are a couple of things that you need to look at on the client side to ensure that your organization is ready. One of the key benefits of SharePoint 2013 is its client integration. Everyone looks at SharePoint as mainly a website or a web repository, but there's been a huge amount of work to make sure that Office 2013 connects very tightly in with SharePoint as a repository. Evaluate the versions of Microsoft Office in your organization. We know that all systems don't always get updated in the same pace or at the same time. So knowing what you've got inventoried there makes a big difference. Also inventory your Office-based templates and forms that your organization uses. These will be actually very useful as you go in and those site collections come into place, because the Office clients are set to actually work with SharePoint on these templates and forms like infopath forms or data collection forms that are being done. Hopefully your organization has a number of these, because that shows that you're working very carefully on your automation, but realize that many organizations don't have these quite as much as they may want. So it's a good time to kind of tickle your users and remind them that these are options as you're working with SharePoint and rolling it out, that creating those forms, putting document templates and maybe other types of templates into your document libraries in SharePoint can really help their load. It's not really something that's managed by the firm administrators, except for setting up the SharePoint templates that already have the Office templates in them. But having that and having your users aware and doing as much automation as they can will help you in your life in the long term. So you need to go through and verify your client software. SharePoint 2013 works best with the current generation of Office products. Again, we're talking SharePoint 2013 right now, but Office 365 is also currently equivalent to 2013. So those are, if you've got any Office 365 implementations or deployments, know that you are actually in sync there. Office 365 versions by default point to the cloud store or to the Pro SkyDrive. Be aware of that. There are some ways, but as the users visit your on-site SharePoint, to do those connections and actually set the defaults up, but know that by default they're coming out and they're pointing to the organizational cloud store. SharePoint 2013 is compatible with Office 2007 SP2 forward. The SP2 is important because you do need at least SP1 for Office 2010 on the desktop to make sure that some of the different pieces that SharePoint uses, some of the different APIs are. Note that this does include Mac Office versions 2008 and forward. So it's not just your Windows users that can actually use your SharePoint very well. If you have Macs running Office, then those can participate in your portals and your work sites as well. One of the more interesting pieces with Office 2013 was the introduction of SkyDrive Pro. SkyDrive Pro provides the local file synchronization functionality for SharePoint and actually for some cloud stores. What happens is, if you're familiar with the history, or if you're not familiar with the history, SkyDrive Pro used to be SharePoint Workspaces, which actually used to be Groove. So it's been a kind of evolution. It shares the name with the cloud consumer file store system, but it actually behind the scenes it's quite different. So when you get asked about your SkyDrive, when you actually be very specific about if they're talking about the consumer version of SkyDrive or if they're talking about the enterprise version of SkyDrive Pro. This will be a little bit confusing. It's a similar name or the same name with just an addition, but they're very different technologies on the back end. So you want to make sure that this is clear for your users and that they know what they're working with. The default synchronization location on the desktop is actually above the client documents library. So if your users are used to going in, looking at their document library for various items and seeing a folder under there, Make sure that they take a moment when they set up where the files are going to be synchronized and ensure that it's going to be somewhere where they normally see. Many of the desktops make it difficult or challenging to find that SkyDrive Pro synchronization location, so you want your users to be able to get to their information very quickly. And then we have SharePoint Designer. This is a formerly front page that was split off and targeted as a designer specifically for SharePoint. It's used for power user level customizations. It allows situations such as cross-page web part leakage. It allows CSS style sheet customization, allows a lot of theming. There's a lot of things that SharePoint Designer can do. To its benefit, it has a lot of power in it. It also has been much maligned in the past because it has a lot of power in it, and in the hands of someone who really hasn't been trained or hasn't had a lot of experience in web design can cause a lot of challenges with the sites. Now, there are a number of ways you can get around that. You can actually reset the site to template and definitions to get out of trouble. There's a lot of things that you can do to roll back any changes. But for 2013, the team has actually set it so that the SharePoint Designer permissions can be set on sites to limit certain changes. So you can actually say that there are certain things that users can do with SharePoint Designer. First of all, they have to have permission to do those changes on the site itself. And then you can actually say that if the tool is SharePoint Designer, there's an additional permission check that makes sure that you've given authorization for SharePoint Designer to make that specific change. So now you can go through and make sure that your sites are in place, that they're following your standards. You can give the power users a very precise scalpel rather than a hatchet to go through and change up their customizations as they want. And then there's the Office client integration. This is going to be one of the biggest pieces that many of your users are going to be interested in. Younger generation workers are often very comfortable with the web, using the website and even the Office web applications without any client applications. But for most of your users that you're probably going to see, they're going to enjoy having the client software tied in with the SharePoint repository and be able to work in any manner they choose. There are often multiple ways of connecting with the client software. I mentioned that. We're going to go through a couple of different ways. There are everything from being able to sync an entire site to being able to choose particular libraries to connect in information and to be able to pull all of that down in the way that the users actually want to work. Users can control their client links and configurations through the web interface. So you kind of start things out with the web interface. There are some ways to go from the client and connect it into the SharePoint site. If your users have already visited the SharePoint site, modern versions of the client desktop will actually be very active in finding those and remembering that there are SharePoint locations to be able to put information in or draw information from. But generally, the users have the most control over using the website and going, by the way, launch my local application and put that in place. What we're going to do is we're going to go look at the SharePoint Designer settings on our demo site and then look at some of the client integration points. So here we are back at our web applications configuration location on Central Administration. Earlier we looked at the different settings, and I mentioned the SharePoint Designer settings were located here. So what we can do is we can come in and look at the options that the SharePoint Designer has on this particular web application. We can actually allow or deny the SharePoint Designer to be used on the web application at all. We take that away, then it doesn't matter. There's no functionality available for SharePoint Designer and everything's fairly stable. We can allow or deny the Site Collection Administrator to detach pages from the site template, which means they can use their own templating skills there, do their own design, and be able to change things up. You may or may not allow that, either from your branding people, from your work with the different consistency, or just how visible the site is and how good the users are with their design skills. You can actually allow the site collection administrator to customize the master pages, which aren't just one page being customized, but all of the pages in their site collection will share those changes. The master page being different controls that are common across all of the different sites, and the layout pages about how the web parts are actually organized on each of those pages. Being able to customize those, again, breaks your consistency across your SharePoint farm, but may be very valuable for that site collection owner. Knowing what's going on, making sure that that person understands what the consequences of doing that are becomes very valuable. And making sure if they're not educated or they're not willing to manage their own site to that extent, then you can remove it to prevent any accidental changes happening there. And then allowing the site collection administrators to see the URL structure of their website. Behind the scenes, SharePoint actually has a number of different locations that aren't normally visible to users. If you look at the very top of our web browser here that we're actually doing the web application management, you can see that we've got the underscore, which is almost always some shared location that's a virtual path that takes us to functionality, and then the web application list at ASPX. This will allow the site collection owner in their site collection to see these types of pages and to actually be able to work with some of them, to actually be able to do custom modifications in their area. Again, this is kind of the top level of customization, something that you really want to make sure that the site collection owner understands what the consequences are, that you understand what you may be called upon to support, and when you're in agreement on those, then you can actually leave it checked and allow them to manage the website URL structure itself. So I'm going to leave those there. And we're going to go in and look at some of the other SharePoint options and the Office integration in our new site itself. One thing before we go do that, if you notice, I am logged in as the LNO administrator, which is actually on the Active Directory. Earlier, when I created my new site, I actually set it up with the site collection with a local administrator account. So if I try and go in right now, I'm not going to be able to get in because I'm actually not a member of this site. Note that even though I am a farm administrator, it does check and make sure that I've got access to the sites themselves. I could give myself access, and I'm going to do that, but it will show up on the logs. This is part of the security system of SharePoint that makes sure that even though it can't keep out people with the right level of access, it can at least make sure that it's visible that those people have been there. So what we're going to do is I'm going to change the site collection administrator to myself, or to my current account anyway, and again, I'm going to check and make sure that that account is valid. I haven't fat fingered it. You see it comes in, and now the account here matches the account here for the ownership, for the administrator at least. We'll go through and let that work its way through the system. And now that we've made that change, let's go down into our new site collection and review some of the integration points. Now here's our SharePoint site collection. You notice it actually shows the site collection, that it is a site collection going on here. That's the name, so I know what's going on, but your users need to be thinking about that. If you look here, this is one of the integration points. This will actually synchronize the document library. You can tell that I have a document library because I've got it over here on the left side. You can see down at the bottom, the shared documents, forms, all items for the URL, and I know that's there. If I had, on this machine, I actually don't have Office 2013 or SkyDrive Pro installed. So you can actually see that when I click here, it's going to tell me I don't know how to handle this particular file that's pushing down. If I did have SkyDrive Pro, I would still get a notice that do you want to launch it? It would say go ahead. I would go ahead and launch the application. It would start that synchronization to the predefined SkyDrive Pro location on my desktop or in my document library, wherever I had set that up at. So this is the first and easiest way for your users to come in, gather in the information they've got on their site, pull it down locally, and be able to work with it. So many of the other content types can actually be synchronized with Office Client as well. We'll go and look at the calendar items. And now we see we have our calendar itself. Right now, it's a pretty clear calendar, which is kind of nice to see. But we can actually go into the events themselves. You can see we've got the various pieces that we can look at there, create a new event, do the alerts, approve, reject on workflows. but we can actually go over to the calendar. And over here, you can actually see some pieces here. I could actually take this calendar and connect it to my Outlook if I had Outlook installed on the machine. This would actually synchronize it both with my local Outlook, and it would actually synchronize it with my Exchange if it could get that information through the Outlook connections. So very easily your users can click on there. You see that might not work in this context. What it's basically telling me is I don't have anything on the desktop. It's also saying export to Excel. I can take those sheets and I can pull it down, and it is going to let me click on this, but I don't have Excel installed. So when I click here, again, it tells me I don't have a compatible application, which is saying the web browser itself is going, hey, I opened that up, but you don't have Excel or Excel Reader or any of those pieces, so we're not going to try and push it down for you. Very good piece. And then you can actually see accesses up here as well. So you can go in and you can go in and look at all those kind of things. And if we had SharePoint Designer, this is where we go in, edit the list in SharePoint Designer. We've got those permissions in there. We can actually go in, edit the settings, add the columns, views, all of the different things that we're talking about. It's a very powerful tool, but you need to really make sure that whoever's working with it understands what they're doing and work with the application. So what we're going to do is go down into the site settings. And as you'll see, we've been working with a lot of different options up at the top level with our administration tools up in the central administration. You'll see a lot of the same items duplicated through here. And what I wanted to show you down here was our SharePoint Designer settings again. The site collection owner has the ability to take those permissions, go through, and enable or disable them themselves. So you can see that we enabled all this functionality up at the web application level. But once we got into the template, by default, it's turned off on the template itself. So we gave permission, said you can if you want to. If I had removed one of these, this would be ghosted out. And at this point, I couldn't, as a site administrator, add those in. So we can actually set up the option for the end user and then the capability for them to add it into their site collection as we work through the system.